As his sabre glided powerlessly through 2,000 feet towards the third most shark infested waters in the world, Boots Blesse had a momentary chance to reflect that maybe this time he had been a little bit greedy. 20 minutes before, he had had just enough fuel to get back to Kim Po, having claimed his ninth kill of the war. Then he'd spotted a lone MiG-15 flying on a parallel course. The sensible thing to do would have been to ignore the straggler and concentrate on nursing his sabre home. But Blesse was born with a killer instinct. No guts, no glory. So he descended on the unsuspecting Chinese pilot, attacked from behind, and with a long burst of machine gun fire turned the MiG into a fireball. The Chinese pilot punched out. Blesse was now a double ace. The question was whether he was going to enjoy that status back at base or in a North Korean prison camp, if he survived at all. He had only a few £100 of fuel in the tank and a long, long way back to base. Realizing that his only chance of survival was the sea, he turned the fighter west and got on the radio to explain his situation. As the Sabre passed 1,500 feet, Blesse undid his safety belt. He ejected the canopy, pulled the handle, and was shot out into the airstream. The Sabre fell away as his parachute opened. He was in the water less than a minute later. Blesse unzipped his life raft and climbed in. A spattering of gunfire was coming from the shore, but the gunners had yet to find the range. As he waited, he heard the noise of big radial engines coming closer. A beautiful SA-16 Albatross set down on the water 100 meters away and taxied towards him. Moments later, he was dragged up into the flying boat's belly. The Dumbo immediately set off again, leaving Blesse's raft and his kit floating in the sea. He went to remonstrate with the pilot. They couldn't just leave his stuff behind in the sea. Needless to say that the pilot, who, let's not forget, was currently being shot at by shore batteries, told him exactly where he could shove his raft. So Blesse settled back down in the back of the Dumbo to enjoy the ride home. When the Korean War began in June 1950, the US Air Force's Air Rescue Service was a fledgling organization possessing a variety of aircraft types, most of which had seen service in World War II. The concept of using helicopters and flying boats to rescue downed airmen from behind enemy lines or in hostile waters had gained little interest from the Air Force, despite the ad hoc forces that had garnered some success late in the war. By the time that Boots Blesse was plucked from the East China Sea in late 1952, the 2nd and 3rd Air Rescue Squadrons were well practiced and experienced formations. They had developed procedures integrating fixed and rotary wing aircraft with close air support that remain in use today. Combat search and rescue is one of those things that we slightly take for granted as part of the mix of capabilities in a modern air force. But in truth, it wasn't a thing before World War II. The prevailing assumption before that conflict was that the line of contact between two armies would be quite static. Aviators unlucky enough to be shot down were expected to escape and evade if they could. There was, however, no plan to fly in and rescue them. This situation started to change after France was overrun and the Battle of Britain began. Many German and British pilots found themselves having to either ditch in the English Channel or bail out into it. Given that pilots were scarcer assets than planes at this time, rescuing them was a priority for the RAF and the Luftwaffe. Both air forces worked with their colleagues in the respective navies to assemble ad hoc teams of fast patrol boats and seaplanes to locate and rescue downed airmen. The Germans went as far as to moor 50 rescue buoys in the channel that contained food, water, and supplies. If pilots could get down near to those, then they would have somewhere to shelter. German and eventually also British ships periodically checked the buoys to recover pilots. The Luftwaffe pioneered many of the innovations that would ultimately become essential parts of the search and rescue kit, most notably brightly coloured yellow life jackets, small self-inflating dinghies, and dye kits. Alongside the classic flare gun, these gave pilots a fighting chance of survival in the cold waters of the Channel and North Sea, and a way to attract attention from would-be rescuers. Later in the war, the US added two further innovations to the toolkit: airdroppable lifeboats fitted with long-range engines and equipped with supplies offered crews a chance of survival in the vast Pacific Ocean long enough to be picked up. These lifeboats also contained the first rescue radios in the form of the hand-cranked SCR 578 Gibson Girl. Under optimum conditions, this had a range of up to 1,500 miles. Dropped by converted B-17s that were able to accompany B-29 raids relatively close to their targets, the lifeboats saved many lives both as transport and a means to communicate with rescuers. In May 1945, the US Air Force also began to operate a small number of R-4 and R-6 hoverfly helicopters from Tinian, supplementing the ubiquitous OA-10A Catalina flying boats. Helicopters would be an ever more central part of the search and rescue force. They were also used in a limited fashion in Burma to rescue airmen shot down in the jungle. The importance of air evacuation capability was recognized in March 1946 when the Air Rescue Service, hitherto more of a set of ad hoc formations, was officially established as a part of the Air Transport Command. In the years that followed, new equipment trickled into the command to support the mission as late war developments entered production. In 1947, the ARS's R4 and R6 helicopters were replaced by 20 or so new Sikorsky R5s. The R5, redesignated H-5 in 1949, was a small single-engined helicopter powered by a 450 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R985 radial. Capable of just 60 knots, the H-5 had a service ceiling of 4,000 feet and a useful range of 150 miles. It could safely carry the pilot and two passengers, one of whom would either be a pararescue man or a medical technician in the back behind the pilot. Some H-5s were fitted with a winch and inflatable collar on the left side, enabling them to pick up airmen from locations where the helicopter couldn't land. By today's standards, the H-5 was a terrifyingly rudimentary machine. Weighing only 1,250 pounds fully loaded, it shook and rattled throughout the flight range. The panels had big gaps between them. The engine gave just about adequate power, but no margin whatsoever. It required use of maximum RPM to lift the pilot and two passengers, for which it was officially rated. An additional man could also be lifted if the pilot was willing to go beyond maximum RPM, which happened a great deal in Korea. Because it was so light, the center of gravity was significantly affected by the locations of the passengers. To remedy this, crews carried a 60-pound jerry can full of oil and sand. When carrying the pilot and rescue man, the can was carried up front. With three on board, the can had to be moved to the tail compartment. Moving that 60-pound weight must have been somewhat entertaining while the helicopter was moving around and under fire. The icing on the cake for the pilot was that the H-5 had very limited instrumentation and was thus suicidal to fly in anything other than good weather. Even so, it could reliably land and take off vertically with a small load. This was revolutionary capability in 1945 and 46. The Navy designated the H-5 as the HO-3S and used them as plane guards on aircraft carriers. During takeoff and recovery operations, the plane guard would hover nearby, ready to swoop down and pick up aviators who ended up in the water. Also in 1947, the 17 SB-17Gs that carried lifeboats were supplemented by SB-29s, which could accompany bombing raids all the way to the run into the target and then escort them on the way back out. Although definitely obsolete by 1950, the SB-17G still had some life left in it. The A1 lifeboat it carried was constructed of laminated mahogany, a lightweight material if ever I saw one. It contained 20 watertight compartments and carried two air-cooled engines, each sufficient to propel the craft at 5 knots. If both were operating, then it could reach a heart-stopping 8 knots. One nifty feature of the A1 were the saltwater-activated rescue lines that ejected from the lifeboat when it struck the water, helping men to swim to them. The SB-17G itself required 9 crewmen, 2 pilots, a navigator, a radar operator, flight engineer, radio operator, 2 waist gunners, and the tail gunner. The larger Super Dumbo was a really lovely piece of kit in my view. The ARS started with a standard B-29A. They filled the bomb bay with fuel tanks to give extra range and to mitigate the aerodynamic downsides of lugging around a 29-foot-long A3 lifeboat. The lower forward twin gun turret was removed and replaced by an APQ-13 ground scanning radar that enabled the Super Dumbo to locate downed airmen and lifeboats. 16 of these aircraft were converted by 1950. In 1949, the tired Catalinas were supplemented by the new SA-16 Albatross. The Albatross was a 60-foot-long, 30,000-pound aircraft with a range of nearly 3,000 miles. It too carried a search radar, the AN/APS-31. Although on paper its performance was roughly the same as the Catalina, it was a much more modern aircraft in terms of its avionics and its ease of use. Another outstanding feature of its design were the reversible pitch propellers, which made for a very short takeoff and landing run. It could also use JATO rockets for short-field takeoffs. One important operational limitation for use in the often choppy waters around Korea was that it was unable to operate in seas over 5 feet. Finally, Douglas Skytrains, designated SC-47 in the Air Rescue Service, continued to soldier on as long-range spotters and transport aircraft alongside their more celebrated comrades. About 30 of these were available to the ARS in 1950. Hence, in total, by 1950, the ARS had about 75 fixed-wing aircraft and 20 or so helicopters spread around the US and its foreign outposts. It's not a huge force when you think about it, especially considering what was about to happen. At 4 in the morning on the 25th of June 1950, North Korean forces launched an all-out offensive into the south. The US response, under a NATO banner, started with massive use of air power. B-29 missions started on June the 28th. Over the coming months, they flattened much of North Korea's infrastructure with impunity. Initially, they encountered little resistance. North Korea's ground-based gun defenses were inadequate against the superfortress, and their piston-engined fighters could only barely make it to the 30,000 feet or higher altitudes that the bombers struck from. Despite the limited risks, the raids were accompanied either by SB-17s or SB-29s from the 2nd ARS and operating from Japan and the Philippines. The Super Dumbos would take off and fly the same mission profile as the strike. As the bombers went over the border into North Korea, the rescue aircraft would orbit. As they emerged back over the Yellow Sea, the SB-29s reformed with them, ready to drop the lifeboat down to any crew who had to ditch. That crew would then await rescue either by one of the many Navy ships in the area or by a Catalina or an Albatross. This plan worked fine in June, July, and August, but over those months the situation began to change. As more US and Allied troops entered the theatre, they brought with them a preponderance of tactical fighters. Navy carriers also surged into the region. Suddenly there were over 1,000 fighters operating on the peninsula, and inevitably some of those were shot down. In fact, by the end of hostilities, the UN forces would lose 1,309 tactical aircraft, around 600 of which were lost to enemy action. Their crews often needed rescuing, and those rescues more often than not needed to take place over land and in close contact with the enemy, where a giant lifeboat wasn't greatly useful. With the Super Dumbos otherwise employed, this job initially fell on a few SB-17Gs and SC-47s, and a handful of H-5s. The 3rd ARS's SB-17s were particularly active. Based out of Kimpo, they searched for downed crewmen, dropped agents behind North Korean lines, conducted weather and reconnaissance missions as well. Having started the war unarmed, flying fortresses were rearmed so that they carried 2 50 caliber machine guns in the top turret, one on each of the waist gunner positions and two in the tail. None of the SB-17s were lost to enemy action in this period, despite the presence of enemy fighters. Two were, however, written off when one of the aircraft's brakes failed while it was taxiing on ice at a shear. It collided with another SB-17 and both were damaged beyond repair. Second ARS SB-17s were based out of Okinawa. Being much slower than the B-29s they were tasked to escort, they would take off and circle an island south of Japan. When the B-29 raid past them, they would return to Okinawa, rest and refuel, ready to take off and cover the bombers as they returned. The first operational boat drop by an SB-17 didn't actually involve a B-29. Late in the evening of December the 6th, 1950, a B-26 Marauder crew returning from a night sortie were forced to bail out over the Korea Strait, north of Susa, Japan. A snowstorm prevented the alert aircraft from taking off, so the 3rd ARS dispatched a rescue boat from Fukuoka to begin the search at daybreak. After a long and frustrating search, an SA-16 located the crew a day later, on the afternoon of the 8th of December. But the seas were too rough for the Dumbo to land. Its crew was able to drop off a 6-person inflatable life raft and guide an SB-17 in. At 4:20 in the afternoon, an SB-17 piloted by Lieutenant Carl Dimmitt arrived on the scene and after making a number of passes successfully dropped an A-1. Bad weather led to the rescuers losing sight of the A-1 for 2 days. Eventually, though, the lifeboat was washed up on a beach northeast of Susa. Sadly, only one crew member from the Marauder, a Captain Lewis, had survived long enough in the sea to get into the boat. Although the SB-17 was definitely inferior to the Super Dumbo in most respects, it did have one useful characteristic in the Korean setting. Its clunkier aerodynamics and generally rugged construction meant that it could get airborne from shorter fields and in worse weather than the big superfortress. As it happens, Lieutenant Dimmitt was also the pilot for the second and last combat drop of an A-1 lifeboat in Korea, where there was an actual survivor in the water. On April 7, 1951, he was covering a flight of B-29s attacking airfields near Pyongyang when a call went out that one of the superfortresses had exploded in mid-air. Reaching the site, he located 2 empty life rafts. Then, 2 miles away, he found a life raft containing a single survivor. Executing 2 lifeboat drop patterns, the first to carry out a positive identification, the second to check the wind direction, he dropped the boat on the 3rd pass. Within minutes of the drop, an SA-16 arrived on the scene and rescued the survivor from the A-1. F-51s were then called in to strafe the boat so that it wouldn't fall into enemy hands. A 20-foot mahogany boat would have immediately become the flagship of the North Korean Navy. This was one of the last missions for the SB-17. Shortly thereafter, they were retired and they left the theatre. Helicopter operations over land fell to the 3rd ARS. An advanced party from the 3rd initially deployed to Busan on July the 8th with 2 spotter L-5 aircraft and an SC-47. The marshy ground made their operations impractical and they left the theatre temporarily on the 16th. A week later they returned, and this time they had 6 H-5s with them. Initially, the operational concept was for strip alerts of 1 spotter and 2 H-5s to be posted relatively near to the battle area, either near to MASH units or at airstrips. These were ready to go in and find and retrieve any downed airmen on receipt of either a telephone or radio call. Their secondary focus was to evacuate seriously wounded troops to hospital. In this secondary role, they would evacuate over 7,000 critically wounded personnel over the course of the war. In theory, radio instructions were supposed to come from a single central dispatcher, but in practice, the helicopter squadrons would often get airborne as soon as they heard Mayday calls or at the request of other helicopters returning from the front. Casualty evacuation was the order of the day for the first month of the 3rd ARS's deployment. Demand was high. With intense fighting ongoing at Busan and Miring, the helicopters were also needed to evacuate injured troops, ferry supplies, and so on. In early August, another 25 H-5s were therefore requested. Ultimately, 14 brand new aircraft would be sent to the south. Then on September the 4th, a new era began. Captain Robert E. Wayne of the 35th Fighter Bomber Squadron was shot down on a strafing run behind enemy lines just north of Pohang. He was rescued by an H-5 piloted by Captain Paul Van Bowen. Van Bowen's rescue went well despite the fact that the 3rd ARS had never really thought in detail about how a rescue would be executed in the face of active resistance from the enemy. The H-5 was already at the limit of its carrying capacity with 3 people aboard. There was therefore no real opportunity to arm it, nor did the 3rd ARS apparently ever consider it. In the initial phase of the war, cover for the slow-moving, vulnerable helicopters was provided on an ad hoc basis by the downed pilot squadron mates. These fighters would protect the helicopter from enemy fighters, which would have found it hard to attack something moving so slowly so close to the ground in any case. But their main task was to keep the defending soldiers' heads down while the helicopter set down. H-5 crewmen took to carrying carbines to add to the suppressing fire, making the humble H-5 arguably the first helicopter gunship. This arrangement was usually fine if the pilot was from a squadron operating a piston-engined type like the Mustang Sky Raider or Corsair, as these aircraft had long ranges and the Korean peninsula was comparatively small. Things were, of course, dicier if the downed aviator was from a jet squadron. Because coordination of rescues was quite ad hoc and facilitated through individual air bases, more sophisticated approaches in which piston-engined fighters would be deliberately tasked as a rescap were the exception, not the rule, throughout the war. Short range of the helicopters meant that they moved very regularly in the first months to stay near to the front lines. As they did so, they continued to rack up firsts. For example, on October the 10th, an H-5 flew 60 miles into North Korea and rescued Lieutenant Stan Leonard, a Sea Fury pilot from HMS Theseus. The paradoctor in the back, Captain John Shoemate, braved fire from the North Korean troops closing in on Leonard to bring him aboard. He then became the first person to administer blood plasma in a moving helicopter to keep the wounded pilot alive on the return trip. Other missions are real boys' own stuff. On January the 28th, 1951, a B-26 Marauder took damage and was forced to make an emergency landing at Suwon Airfield, which was held by the North Koreans. Alerted by radio, 2 H-5s, supported by Marine Corps Corsairs, swooped in and rescued the crew from under the North Koreans' noses. There was also the opportunity for a bit of inter-service entertainment. Early in 1951, a 3rd ARS helicopter rescued Marine Corps Captain Russell Patterson and brought him back to the dirt landing strip it was operating from. On arrival, Captain Patterson was informed that he was to be held hostage until the Corps paid a suitable ransom. The next day, a Corsair arrived, carrying 10 gallons of ice cream, 50 pounds of boneless steak, and a bottle of scotch. Duly ransomed, Patterson was returned to the Marines. Another ransom was extracted from HMS Theseus when, on January the 28th, 1951, an H-5 picked up one of its pilots. The ransom for his release was 4 bottles of scotch, which was paid via a liaison officer. Late March 1951 brought a single prototype YH-19 to the front line. The H-19 was a major upgrade over the H-5. It was 4 times as heavy, could fly faster and further with a much larger load of people and material aboard. Up to 10 walking wounded or 8 litters could be carried in the back, along with the pilot, a medic, or a pararescueman. Curiously, despite its lifting capability, there doesn't appear to have been any attempt to arm the H-19 either. It's also worth noting that the initial aircraft was actually owned by the CIA and was thus predominantly used for special missions. For example, on the 17th of April 1951, a MiG-15 crashed in a remote location south of Sinarju, North Korea. The MiG-15 had been terrorizing UN aviators for nearly 6 months, so any intelligence that could be recovered from the downed fighter was very much in demand. Operation MiG was duly launched. The H-19 flew to the location and picked up some scattered pieces. Whether much intelligence was gained is not recorded. A year later, in the summer of 1952, 5th Air Force F-86s shot down a MiG-15 near to the mouth of the Yalu River. The MiG made a belly landing on the silt of the estuary. Another H-19 was dispatched. Lacking sufficient lifting capacity, it couldn't pick up the entire MiG. Fortunately, the crew had brought a precision tool with them to dissect the intelligence windfall. They threw hand grenades at the MiG until it was broken into appropriately small pieces, and then they loaded the resultant bits aboard. Needless to say that they didn't recover a flying example of the fearsome faggot. H-19s were in very short supply throughout the war. A total of 4 YH-19s were delivered to the theatre in 1951. Another 4 were delivered in 2 batches between January and March 1952. That strength of 8 aircraft was maintained for the rest of the war. H-5s therefore continued to shoulder much of the rescue and evacuation burden. Maintenance of these now thoroughly worn-out aircraft became increasingly challenging as 1952 became 1953. By May of that year, 4 of 3rd ARS's 15 active helicopters had been parked up for the long term because their rotor blades had failed and no replacements were available. There weren't enough mechanics to effect repairs either. Although more than a dozen H-5s were lost to various causes over the course of the Korean War, only 5 crewmen were killed. One, para-rescueman Bob Holloway, was captured by the North Koreans in late 1952 and released on the succession of hostilities. During the Korean War, 1,690 US airmen went down in enemy territory. Although a great many were captured and many lost their lives in the crash or in captivity, about 10% of them were rescued by 3rd ARS. Air rescue crews extracted 170 Air Force, Navy, and Marine aviators and 84 pilots flying for other nations in the UN force. Although remarkable, these aren't the best odds. Air Force and Navy crews quickly learned that the best thing to do if their aircraft was damaged was to attempt to make it to the sea. Enemy fighters rarely strayed over the coast because they didn't want to be captured by the UN forces if they were forced to eject. Because there were more flying boats available than helicopters, the chances of a pickup were that much better for a UN flyer punching out over the sea. The first of these rescues took place on the 4th of August 1950 when Ensign Glenn Farnworth had to bail out of his Corsair into the Sea of Japan. He was picked up by an SA-16 operating out of Ashaya Air Base. As the situation on the ground began to stabilize, the UN forces were able to establish a more permanent detachment of H-5s on Chodo Island, about 50 miles north of the 38th parallel. Although within range of North Korean aircraft and thus the occasional target of spoiling attacks and artillery fire, Chodo reduced the amount of time needed to get to a downed flyer and provided a navigational reference point for the pilot of a damaged aircraft to aim for. That pilot would typically be able to radio to his base that he was aiming to bail out in a pre-designated area. They could then dispatch either an H-19, H-5, or a flying boat to the scene, minimizing the amount of time the pilot spent in the water. Despite improvements in rescue gear, hypothermia remained a real danger throughout the war. This was exactly the arrangement that Boots Blesse took advantage of in October 1952. When it was clear to him that he wasn't going to make it back to base, he was able to direct the standing SA-16 patrol to exactly the point at which he intended to eject. In radio contact with the Dumbo up to the moment he ejected, he was barely in the water for 10 minutes before he was rescued. By that evening, he was celebrating his 10th kill with his squadron mates in the bar. Although this kind of relatively controlled rescue was the norm, the SA-16 crews also had to put themselves in harm's way to do their work. For example, on June 5, 1953, a Royal Air Force Sabre pilot, Flight Lieutenant James Ryan, was attacked by MiGs near the Yalu River. He ejected and came down about a mile from the river mouth. Climbing into his dinghy, he was immediately shot at by North Korean troops on both sides of the river. The Dumbo on duty that day was flown by Captain Paul Cahill. He brought the big amphibian in and landed as close as he dared to Ryan. His navigator threw out a line attached to a Mae West life preserver while Cahill circled the pilot until he was able to come aboard. But things weren't concluded just yet. Still under heavy fire, Cahill taxied, Then he threw the throttles to the stops to take off. As the SA-16 accelerated, it hit a swell and was catapulted into the air, landing hard and burying the right wing under water. Miraculously, the wing resurfaced with the float still attached. Cahill was able to make another takeoff attempt, which fortunately went without a hitch. In general, the SA-16 provided excellent service during Korea. It was, however, a new weapon system and did suffer from teething problems with its engines and the reversing functions of its propellers. Specialized tools to disassemble either item were in short supply. Use of hand grenades was not allowed on base, leading to long downtimes. Despite these issues, the SA-16 ultimately rescued around 100 airmen from icy Korean waters over the course of the war. 3 Dumbos were lost in operational accidents, leading to the tragic loss of 1 crew. They died on February the 13th, 1953, when their aircraft crashed into a mountain in Japan during poor weather on a medical evacuation flight. Before I get to conclusions, I'd like to mention 2 unsung heroes of search and rescue missions in Korea. 2, or occasionally 3, Stinson L-5 Sentinel liaison aircraft were available to 3rd ARS throughout the first 2 years of the war. About 3,000 of the little 2,000-pound L-5s had been built during the Second World War and used for all manner of tasks, from taxiing senior officers around to photo reconnaissance. With a cruise speed of 100 miles an hour, they were a good bit faster than the H-5 and could loiter for longer. Because of this, they generally went up ahead of the short-legged helicopters to locate an airman and guide the helos in. Once in a while, though, the situation called for a more direct intervention. The most heralded Sentinel rescue mission occurred on the afternoon of December the 11th, 1950, when First Lieutenant Donald R. Michaelis, flying an L-5 north of Seoul, picked up a mayday from the wingman of a bailed-out F-80 pilot. Learning the location of the downed pilot, Michaelis knew it was too late in the day for a rescue helicopter to go in, so he went off on his own hook. He headed, with fighter escort, to a location a few miles southeast of Pyongyang. Because the area had no landing strips, the JOC at Taegu did not direct Michaelis to continue, but allowed him to proceed at his own discretion. Meanwhile, the escort fighters had pinpointed the downed pilot and relayed it to Michaelis that a nearby road would make a suitable landing strip. He decided to proceed, but finding the road unsatisfactory, he selected a nearby frozen rice paddy. On his 3rd attempt, he executed the difficult landing on the paddy. The downed pilot, First Lieutenant Tracy Mathewson of the 8th FBS, made a dash for the L-5. Perhaps surprised at the daring rescue attempt, the enemy troops did not fire until Mathewson had nearly reached the rescue aircraft. Their gunfire quickly attracted the attention of the escorting fighters, whose strafing enabled the L-5 to take off. For this rescue, Lieutenant Michaelis earned the Silver Star. Having provided similar services for 2 years, the arrival of half a dozen H-19 helicopters in February 1952 reduced the need for the L-5s, and they were sent back to Japan for the duration. The other critical but unglamorous part of the air rescue mix was the Douglas Skytrain. For most of the war, 3rd ARS operated 3 SC-47s, one of which was generally stationed in Korea. The aircraft was a derivative of the C-47 that had become famous during World War II as a paratroop transport, glider tug, and supply aircraft. From 1950 to 1953, Skytrain served the ARS by relocating its Korean helicopter detachments in their frequent moves and by performing medical evacuations, searches, and escort sorties, all in addition to their bread and butter mission of hauling requisite supplies, equipment, and aircraft parts. More than other ARS aircraft, the Douglas SC-47 operated as a jack of all trades. To give you a sense of the variety of missions it performed, on July the 7th, 1950, on the first deployment of 3rd ARS elements to Korea for sustained operations, an SC-47 transported 2 L-5s from Japan to K-1 base in Korea. 7 days later, an SC-47 collected 5 survivors who had bailed out of a flaming B-29 returning from a bombing sortie. A Japanese fishing vessel had picked up the airmen and delivered them to the town of Miho in Japan. On October the 5th, the 3rd ARS SC-47 flew supplies in support of ground troops. The same aircraft evacuated 17 POWs back to Japan on November the 26th. On December the 1st, during the critical period following the Communist Chinese intervention, an SC-47 flew an observation sortie to determine how best to assist a trapped American division. It then, on the 10th of December, picked up the sole survivor of a downed B-26 who had been saved by an A-1 lifeboat dropped by an SB-17. This was how the war continued. The Skytrains flew roughly one mission per aircraft per day for 3 years, always available whatever the weather, the tactical situation, or the demand. The stories of the Sentinel and Skytrain, I think, symbolize the Air Rescue Service's war. From their first deployment only days after the conflict started until well after the ceasefire, the service's pilots and crews demonstrated extraordinary bravery and resourcefulness. What had begun the war as a concept of air rescue matured into a clear approach to the mission. Whereas in the summer of 1950, a pilot down behind enemy lines simply expected to have to walk out, by the end of that year and thereafter, it was assumed that the ARS would make a determined attempt to retrieve him. But this success didn't guarantee continued focus on the mission higher up. ARS finished the Korean War with 7,900 personnel. By 1961, this was down to 1,600. Worse still, because of the Eisenhower-era expectation that conventional wars wouldn't be fought again, the mandate of ARS was reduced so that they were to focus only on peacetime search and rescue. Equipment for combat search and rescue was therefore not procured, and crews were not trained in it. As a result, the Air Force was unprepared for the task of long-range aircrew rescue over the Vietnamese jungles. Many of the lessons learned and paid for in lives by the 2nd and 3rd ARS would have to be learned and paid for again in the early years of Rolling Thunder. Fortunately, this time they proved to be more enduring.